Hi guys, just before we start the episode today, whatever platform you are listening to this on, whether it be on the podcast, Apple Podcast, YouTube, whatever it is, please support it. Please like, subscribe, whatever you can do. We want to reach as many people as possible. So please do that and we'll get right into the episode. Welcome to another episode of the Chronic Comeback Podcast. Today is a bit of a special episode. Normally we are focusing on, specifically on recovery stories, but today we've managed to get on the show Dr. Neil Nathan. So just to give you a bit of detail on Dr. Neil, he has been a board certified family physician and is also a founding diplomat of the American Board of Holistic Medicine, and recently actually retired from clinical practice after 5 decades of patient care. From the time he began medical school, it's always been his passion to try and help as many patients as possible, never satisfied with sending patients home with the cliche, "Sorry, we don't have answers for you," which is obviously something that a lot of people listening to this have experienced themselves. So, this is refreshing to hear. In his opinion, conventional medicine has many answers, but sometimes they aren't enough. Slowly, his practice evolved into something new. They didn't really have a name, and he called it complex medical problem solving. Over time, he found himself working with the most unfortunate of patients who had not received a clear diagnosis from conventional medicine and were suffering with persistent and debilitating illnesses. A lot of you guys will know him from the book Toxic, Heal Your Body from Mold Toxicity, Lyme, MCS and other environmental illnesses. That was a book that I read as soon as I found out that I had an issue with mold. And he's actually got a new book out called Energetic Diagnosis, which is something I need to read, published in December 2021, which delves into the importance of the use of intuition and new energetic devices in the diagnosis and treatment of chronic illness. I'm so excited to have you on, Neil. We've had a number of questions, so rather than me kind of just bore you with my questions, we've got a lot of questions from our listeners. So if it's okay, well, first of all, how are you doing? Thanks for coming on the show.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. And I'm ready to fire away when you are.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I guess actually one question that's just come to mind, because this show's all about the belief of not necessarily just recovery, because I think that's important, but just enjoying your life and belief that you can enjoy your life and that you can better your situation. How important do you think honing that belief, cultivating that belief is important in someone's recovery from or bettering their situation? How important is that belief?
I think it's critical. If someone, as you say, I've been doing this for 5 decades, which only means that I'm old. But having worked with, 100,000 people or more over a long period of time, it's very clear to me that if someone doesn't believe they can get better, they won't, even if they're doing the right things. And if someone believes they can, eventually they will find a way to heal. So is belief important? Absolutely, it is. And you touched on something which is a little different than belief, which is joy. And that's harder to come by. I can tell you that from my personal life, even though I've had a blessed life in almost every way, but it's so easy to get caught up in the nitty-gritty details of life, the tasks that we have to do or tell ourselves we have to do, or we misplace, I would say, what's really important, that I think many people don't cultivate joy. And I think that is a really important component to healing. The older I get, the more convinced I am that it's essential if you can find it. And joy comes out of being true to yourself. It's a little bit different than healing, although healing requires that as well. It just means understanding the meaning and purpose of your life and living it. to the max. And again, we often get caught up in ways that we don't. I mean, I used to ask patients all the time, okay, what gives your life meaning and purpose? And it's astonishing how many of my patients would go, I really have no idea. And I go, well, gosh, we have a lot of work to do. Because that's where true healing comes from, where the energetic flow of spirit comes through us spiritually with what gives us meaning and purpose. And if we don't have that, it's a longer journey and it's a much harder journey. And it's something that should be sought. You can't just adopt it. I've never tried to suggest to anyone that my meaning and purpose had any relevance to them at all. It doesn't. It's yours, and you have to uncover it. And when it happens, then life is easier. It's like, okay, now I have a star to follow. Anyway, so I think that's a really important point.
You mentioned a number of really interesting things there. First of all, I like the fact that you said that you've lived a really blessed life in every way, and I think that just says something about yourself. That I remember speaking to someone, and he said, I'm the luckiest guy in the world, and just lucky things happen to me. But when he's talking about it, it's just like he drew those things into his orbit because he thought he was lucky. So he drew more of those things. And I think if you're constantly focusing on how blessed you are, more of those things will be drawn into your life. And do you find that with your own life?
Absolutely. I've studied a lot of spiritual paths, and eventually I've sort of distilled it down for myself as basically three things, which is to live with gratitude, with mindfulness, and to be of service. And, that's a lot, actually, to try to fit into every day as a goal. But I think that those are the things that give life meaning to me, and I think for others. So again, we can talk about luck attracting good things, but I think that another word for that might be gratitude, appreciation, where you look at the things you have with, I have so much, as opposed to, I don't have enough. And that's a big difference in how you look at life. If you will, it's like, is the glass half filled or is the glass half empty? Well, it's neither. It's how you see it.
Yeah. And I just thought something else you said as well. I was like, you were like, asking yourself how much purpose you have in your life. And I was just like, can you imagine if every doctor you went to see, instead of asking you, how much iron do you have in your diet, they would say, well, how much purpose do you have in your life at the moment? That, maybe chronic illness wouldn't be as, prevalent.
Maybe. But I don't think it's a common question that's asked.
No.
Especially in the modern practice of medicine, where the person who may be supposedly caring for you has their back turned to you and they're typing into a computer, and they're not even looking at how you are responding to their questions, that it's more important that they enter it into the computer properly than that they connect to you. So medicine has taken a couple of steps backwards in the last 20 years.
So what I'm really interested in is, well, there's a lot of things I'm really interested in, but one of the things I'm really interested in, why do you think, and I'm sure there's a lot of different nuances to this answer, but why do some people get better so why do some people get a bug, a virus, and it knocks them down for a couple of weeks, then they just recover and they just get on with their lives? And why do others just get stuck in this loop of chronic issues? Why is there one like underlying factor, or is it just a whole host of things?
That is not a simple answer. That's probably a 2-hour lecture.
Okay.
But the simplistic, quick overview It has to do with the strength of your immune system, which in turn is related to your life experiences, whether you've had a tough, stressful existence so that your limbic system is wired to be hypervigilant to stimuli, and you start reacting to things in a way that's not in your own best interest. It's a protective mechanism, but it becomes overprotective after a while. The vagal nerve jumps in there. People get mast cell activation. Genetics plays a role. What you eat, your chemistry, again, how you've lived your life, your activity level, exercise, whether you have access to good, clean air, whether you live in the country or you live in the city, whether you have, again, whether you eat organic or not, what you're putting into your body. It's really quite complicated.
Yeah.
But it's the essence of it is how you have taken care of your body and how you have processed all of the things that have happened to you. So for some people, if they've kind of had a lot of bad things happen to them throughout their life, but their attitude is, well, I have to be strong. I have to be strong for my family or for fill in the blanks, whatever it has to be. And if you don't allow yourself to process those emotions, if you get stuck in some emotional loops, then all of this predisposes you to be affected by the increasing toxicity of the world that we live in. So sorry, there's not an easy answer to that question.
No, that was a very, very good, succinct answer. As you said, that could have been, as you said, a 2 hour lecture. And even then, I don't think you would have been able to kind of get around all of it. One thing that has come up a lot, the great thing about doing this podcast is we're almost at 100 episodes now. So we've spoken to a lot of people who've recovered. So you get to see commonalities in why people recover. And it's very rare that someone has come on the show and has just said, yeah, I went gluten-free and I just got better. There's very often an element of brain retraining that people use. And one of the questions that someone has asked, which I thought was a great question, and I've been wondering it too. So what are your general thoughts on brain retraining? And I know it's something that you do recommend, but how much of healing is detox and how much is neurological rewiring? And also, what are your thoughts around trauma in relation to mold illness and chronic illness?
You like asking questions that require 30-minute answers, don't you?
That was someone else's question, so
okay. Sorry. Well, you did the asking. So, I mean, there's just so much in that. First of all, everything stems from diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
And that means diagnosis on every level. Diagnosis on the physical plane, mental plane, energetic plane, emotional plane, and spiritual plane. But a clear diagnosis for someone is, why am I sick? Why am I ill? How did that happen? How did it evolve? And it has to be clear. And I think that that's one of the biggest issues for a lot of people who do become ill and they're having trouble figuring it out, because medicine isn't geared for that. It's geared for acute injuries. Chronic illness is not properly taken care of by medicine these days. So if that has happened, the individual has to do their own research. They have to begin to dig into it on their own with an open mind and an open heart, so they can really take a good look at themselves and go, okay, this is the reality. Once you have a good diagnosis, then we can ask these other detailed questions. So for example, not everyone needs to reboot emotionally or spiritually. For some people, they just have gluten intolerance and they will get well. I mean, it could be that simple. I haven't seen that very often because my practice evolved as a referral practice where I was seeing the very ill patients of my colleagues who didn't know what to do with them. So the easy things like, oh, you have gluten intolerance, just stop eating gluten. That doesn't happen very much in my life anymore. We began to see more complicated illnesses, things like mold toxicity and Lyme disease and chronic viral infections, chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia and autism and neurodegenerative diseases. They all have something in common, which is an inflammatory process that's gone off the rails. And so, but again, you have to ask, you got to take a step back and go, okay, in this particular individual, what triggered that process? Because that's what you have to treat to get them over it. So I'll use mold toxicity as an example. If you have mold toxicity, getting the mold out, absolutely primary. Do they have to detoxify? Absolutely. But most eventually develop limbic and vagal dysfunction and mast cell activation, and those do need to be addressed. So how common is that? Very common. And for the patients who have become really sensitive, in which they can't take the substances that they want, or they have a bad reaction to almost everything, those patients need to work on their vagal and limbic systems first, or they're not going anywhere. Because maybe I'll talk about it for a second. The limbic system is the part of the brain that monitors basically you for safety. And specifically, it affects emotion and sensitivity. So if you have not been anxious or depressed all your life, and all of a sudden you are, and you start having panic attacks or mood swings or become OCD, and you have new increasing sensitivities to light, sound, touch, food, chemicals, or EMF, then your limbic system is involved. And when it becomes involved, it starts working with what we call the vagal nerve system to work together, monitoring your body internally and externally for safety. And if your nervous system, this is not psychological, if your nervous system isn't convinced you're safe, it's going to shut you down and not let you do things. So once someone gets behind the 8-ball, working on both the limbic and vagal systems together, if you only work on one, the other one's going to stay hypervigilant. So you have to work on them together in order to quiet them down, literally reboot them, in order for the body to go, oh, okay, I'm safer now. Now I can take these things that you were trying to give me before, and now I can benefit from it. So I hope that's answering your question.
No, I think it is. And I think it's good to have, I think I and a lot of people I speak to maybe focus a little bit too much on the physical side of things because we come from the traditional medical system. There's something bad inside me, get it out of me. It's nothing to do with my mind. What do you have an opinion on what comes first? Is it the fact that I had, because I when I found out I had an issue with mold, which was about 9-10 years into me, no, I hadn't even heard of mold. It was on a podcast with I forgot what his name is now. Oh God, it doesn't matter. That was it. So then I got myself tested for mold, and I was off the charts. So then I was highly attuned to mold. This was before I found out about like limbic system dysfunction and everything. And I wonder now when I look back at it, it's like, although it was great finding out about mold, then I'm reading books like it's called Avoid, I think it's Mold Avoidance, and they're talking about, escaping to the middle of the desert and stuff like that. And if anything, it feels like that's just making you more hypervigilant and making things worse. And so I just wonder, well, what's your opinion on that? Sorry, I'm asking you two questions again. But also, what do you think comes first? Is it the fact that I've got a limbic system impairment and that's let the mold in? I'm not asking this in a very medical way. Or is it the other way? Is it that molds come in first and then that's caused that?
I wish it was that easy. I think it, again, depends on the individual. I think there are people who simply are living in a very moldy environment and don't know it, who slowly and insidiously get sick. And as their immune system gets weaker and weaker, and their body becomes weaker and weaker, they become more prone to a host of other things that come on. Eventually, they will develop limbic and vagal dysfunction and mast cell activation. Doesn't happen right away. However, having said that, that sort of implies that the mold toxicity comes first. And mostly it does. But I think that not everyone who lives in the same moldy environment will have the same response to that. It's not unusual to have a family in which one or two people in the family are sick and the other two are not, and they're living in the same environment. So, okay, why are two people sick and two not? Sometimes we blame it all on genetics, but I don't think it's that simple. I think the people who have had more stress over time, their nervous system becomes more prone to being affected by these toxins and stimuli. So it's a little bit of both. And I think always we have to look at each individual uniquely and go, okay, what are your predisposing events, if there are any? So I think I'm addressing your question.
Yeah, no, I think you are. It's just, I think it's difficult because every question I ask has like, it depends on who you are, depends on, situation.
Right. And if you haven't figured it out by now, I hate simplistic answers because human beings are not simplistic.
No.
They are complicated, and we're all different from one another. So a lot of the physicians that I teach want an algorithm, which is okay. Let's say you have this illness. What do you do, Neil? In this order. And I want to know exactly, step by step. And I go, there isn't an algorithm. You have to look at each person uniquely and go, okay, what does this person need? It won't be the same for the next person. But some people, physicians, are very uncomfortable with that conceptualization of individuality. And unfortunately, they try to impose some kind of an algorithm on how they do things. They'll help some people, but other people won't be helped because they're not open to looking at the totality of what's going on.
How important do you think, I know you mentioned getting a clear diagnosis. How important do you think that is? It sounds like you said it is really important, but like, I've now got a view on it that I don't know whether when people get a diagnosis, they cling really heavily to that title and it becomes part of their identity almost. And
yes.
And that in itself can be quite negative.
Correct.
Okay.
So I'm not into clinging to a diagnosis, because you are correctly saying that there's some pathology in that. It's sort of like identifying yourself with, I am a mold toxic person. And so now I have some identity. I didn't before, but now I do. Well, I'm not sure that's an identity you want. I think you want to identify yourself as, I am a vital, alive human being with a purpose in my life, and I happen to have fill in the blank, mold or Lyme, or doesn't matter what it is. But I think you're alluding to, there are some downstream effects of mold toxicity and Lyme disease that almost everybody has, and some people get that label and they cling to that thinking that that's their answer, meaning you have methylation dysfunction, you have mitochondrial dysfunction, and those aren't really answers. They're not really labels. They sound like labels, but they're actually a downstream effect of more important things. And so when I say diagnosis, I really mean primary diagnosis. What's causing the majority of whatever this person is experiencing? One of the most important models that have emerged in the last 10 years is Bob Naviaux's cell danger response model. Are you familiar with that?
No,
okay.
No.
So if you're not, I would encourage you to Google it and read about it. Bob Naviaux's name is spelled Naviaux, is a professor at the University of California, San Diego, in pediatrics and genetics. And he's one of the most incredible biochemists I've ever met. And after years of research, in 2013, he came up with a model to explain virtually all chronic illness which he calls the cell danger response. And basically, it's complicated chemistry, and I'm not going to bore you with that here. But the Cliff Notes version of that is that on a cellular level, which extends to the entire body, the entire organism, if a cell feels threatened by a toxin, infection, or stress, it basically shuts itself down and then warns the neighboring cells, oh, we got a problem. It's a beautifully biochemically orchestrated dance that Dr. Naviaux has studied in detail, and he lays it out so that people can understand that if you're going to get well, you have to think about getting well in a specific order. If you try to do something before the body is ready for it, won't work. So in its most primitive way, the body goes into survival mode. So you could work with a functional medicine physician who goes, you're selenium and zinc deficient, you're not methylating, and they could go, that's what we need to do. That will fix you. And they're missing the point, because if the body's in survival mode because of a toxin, an infection, or stress, it won't be able to do anything with that. It almost goes, thank you for nothing. I can't use that now. I've got bigger issues at hand here, and I've got to deal with these bigger issues before I get around to using that. And I think that that is a major obstacle in the medical field, is a lot of practitioners don't understand that basis. So you have to come to it that way. So when I talk diagnosis being central and important, what I mean is what I will call the diagnosis. What's triggering all of this? And unfortunately, many of my patients have an infection and toxins and stress. And so it's not simple. But if I don't focus on that as a starting point, I'm in the wrong starting point.
But then do you, well, actually, I just want to quickly, the cell danger response, is that, so that's something you can just read online? There's no actual book on it?
Right. If you no, there's no book on it. If you simply Google the cell danger response, Robert Naviaux, some of his papers will pop right up.
Okay.
Now,
awesome.
It's intense biochemistry, but they're very worth reading. And it's a fabulous, accurate model for what's happening. And it really explains a lot.
Yeah. Okay. And just going back to your point on the diagnosis and having a starting point, do you think that some practitioners, though, can then just isolate it to, okay, you've got Lyme, so we're just going to do Lyme-related treatments rather than treat you? The way I'm starting to think about it is that there's an energetic, or there's an imbalance in me that needs to be rebalanced or something. And I could, and from doing these episodes, I speak to people who had the diagnosis of, chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia or Lyme disease. And it seems to me that they essentially had, while they're displaying different symptoms, they essentially had the same thing, and they all got better in actually a very similar way. So would it not be better almost just have a collective diagnosis in that way rather than pigeonholing people?
Well, I don't know that it helps to think about it that way. The label helps people to understand what we're going to be doing. But again, if I said, okay, you have Lyme disease, let's treat that. Lyme disease is more than just an infection. When we first started looking at it, it was that. But it's also turns into something that needs detoxification. It's also something that affects the pituitary, so it affects the adrenal, thyroid, and sex hormones. It also affects on and on and on. So as a label, it's a starting point, but it's a much more comprehensive overlook that we have to do. So you're right. Lyme disease, mold toxicity, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, there's a huge overlap in symptoms and in treatment. The key is, if somebody is responding to what you're doing, then you're on the right path. If they're not responding, then you have to look around for what else am I missing. So, I mean, it might help your listeners for an overview. I wrote a couple of books, I don't know, 15 years ago. One is still available, called Healing is Possible. And it's an overview of chronic illness like chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. And I to simplicity's sake, I called it the big six and the little six, which were the six most important things that triggered it, and then six other things that people needed to be looked at, just so that they could get an overview of what should I be looking at. And it includes things like, again, thyroid, adrenal, hormone function, magnesium deficiency, gut dysbiosis, food allergy, and so on and so on. It's a nice overview. Since then, we've learned more. So again, my book Toxic goes into that in more detail, but since you've read it, it's really an overview. It's okay, if you're feeling sick, what things do you want to look at? And the phrase I use, what systems need to be rebooted? And so we talk about rebooting the nervous system, the immune system, the gut, the endocrine system, etc. All of which have to be looked at, because now, for some people, some systems are way more important than others, which is why you have to individualize it. Am I making sense in my description here?
Yeah. No, you definitely are. No, thank you for that. I've had a couple of questions that are kind of the same, so I'm going to merge them together. I think these are from two like very sensitive people in terms of their reactions to stuff. So what do you do if, and I think I've heard you actually answer this on another podcast, so it must be a question that comes up a lot. What do you do if everything you try makes you feel worse, even the slightest binder or supplement? You've been having on the cleanest diet and out of mold for years, and so you're just in this kind of loop and in circles. What do you do at that point?
Well, again, I specialize in treating people like that and have for years. So as I alluded to before, and it may be worth repeating, when someone gets that sensitive, what it means by definition is that their limbic system has become dysfunctional, the vagal nerve is dysfunctional, and most of them will have mast cell activation. And they can't do anything until you fix those. So that's job one. For some people, and I guess in that context, my newer book, Energetic Diagnosis, might become relevant. There's an energetic or emotional block that is keeping them from moving forward. And it's almost like their body's saying, sorry, but you're not going anywhere until you fix this. It's often things we don't want to look at, but the body isn't trying to hurt you, it never is. It's trying to educate you, it's trying to teach you. So it's going, okay, this is what's going on. We're going to have to dig deeper and figure this out. So again, the quick answer, and it's really an important one, for those folks, if you haven't done it, you need to do limbic retraining. You need to focus on the techniques that will reboot the vagus nerve, and then look into mast cell activation, primarily. For some of my patients who are that sensitive, they can't take the materials they need to take for mast cell activation until they do 3 to 6 months of limbic and vagal rebooting. It may take a while, but if they're patient, virtually everyone I've ever worked with has gotten there, with the exception that for some people, there is a deep-seated energetic or emotional block, which you're going to have to look at differently and fix that. So I hope that's helpful for those folks.
That definitely is. Well, I assume it would be for them. Answer the question, in the way I was wondering it. Bringing this, actually, I might as well make it a selfish question, given that I'm here. And I think there will be other people that are going through the same thing. So I'm quite lucky in the sense that I've never been one of those types of people that will have the tiniest of things and then I'll be in bed for days. I am intolerant of things. I am sensitive to things, but not incredibly. I can have things and it won't debilitate me. But I do know there is something with my like limbic system, because I'm really sensitive to sounds. Like I constantly feel like I'm on edge. I feel like I'm getting like almost like a level of ADHD. Like I can't focus on things like for as long as possible. And so it's very clear that is the issue. When I've tried to do brain retraining and the limbic system stuff, I find it really difficult to the whole like tapping into emotions, the visualization side of things. And because that's like really key, because you're tapping into, frequencies of, good emotions, joy and stuff like that. And able to put yourself in that state. Hope I'm making sense. For someone like that, where is that what you mean by like a blockage there? Because I feel like there is a blockage there for me.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, I think that's very clear. So first of all, the different methods that are available to reboot the limbic system need to be done differently than often the way they're portrayed. Let me be specific about that. The two major systems that I've worked with are the Annie-Hopper DNRS program, Dynamic Neural Retraining, or the Ashok-Gupta Amygdala Retraining program. Both of them are excellent, and I've had great results with them. And here comes the but. But for very sensitive patients, you can't do it full bore the way they're presented. For example, with the Annie-Hopper program, there are three major components to her program. There's what she calls rounds, which involves saying certain phrases, going through certain motions, and using certain gestures repeatedly over and over again. Now, these phrases and gestures are based on the latest research in neuroplasticity, so they're very sound. She then asks that you apply that to past traumas and emotional experiences that were upsetting, and to visualize the future. What I tell my sensitive patients is don't look into the past and do not look into the future until later. Your body will react to that badly and it will set you back. It won't work. And Annie and Ashok say that you have to do it for an hour a day to get much benefit from it. And I don't agree with that. And so that 15, 20 minutes a day is great for most people. And many people who are that sensitive also have some degree of fatigue and cognitive impairment. So literally, their brain can't do it for an hour. It's not that they don't want to. They literally can't. It would overwhelm them and would actually set them back. It would be counterproductive. So if we're talking about those things, they need to be done more gently and less often than the way they are literally prescribed in order for them to be effective. So, again, if you're not working with a healthcare provider who understands it, you may just buy into what's being taught to larger groups of people, because it may not apply to you because you're too sensitive. You have to scale it back for it to work. But the vast majority of people that I've worked with have responded well to that once it's modified. Now, the other thing that I mentioned, and I want to emphasize it, is if the limbic and vagal systems are both hypervigilant and you only work on the limbic system and you don't work on the vagal system, your system will stay hypervigilant. So you've got to work on both simultaneously. So if we're going to be talking about vagal systems, there are exercises you can do. There is osteopathic cranial manipulation that is very helpful. There's a medical device called frequency-specific microcurrent, which can be helpful. There's another device called Brain Tap. Stephen Porges, who put our understanding of the vagus system on the map, has a sound-based system called Safe and Sound. There's another system of tapping on the acupressure points over the face called Emotional Freedom Technique. All of these are helpful. But patients need to know from the beginning that you've got to do some limbic retraining and some vagal retraining simultaneously if you're going to make any progress. And I think that's where patients will go, I did anti-hopper for 6 months and I got a smidge better and then not much happened. Well, then I know they haven't been doing the full treatment. So yeah, it didn't work, but they're not understanding what they need to be doing to really make the reboot happen.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm currently doing a program for a practitioner who actually came on the podcast. It's called Primal Trust, and I'm just going through it at the moment, and it combines brain retraining, their vagal system stuff, somatic exercises, and my God, I can't remember the fourth one. But I think those are the three main.
I've heard of it. I've had a few patients do that program, but I don't have anywhere near the experience with it that I do with the other programs that I talked about. So keep in mind, if you have mast cell activation and you're not doing that also, then that may be the stumbling point. Because mold toxicity in at least 70% of patients will eventually trigger mast cell activation. And mast cell activation is a cellular equivalent of the neurological hypervigilance that you also have to really work with to quiet it down.
Okay, and that's actually, someone's actually asked here, are MCS and MCAS, which is...
it's MCAS,
yeah,
mast cell activating syndrome, which is different from MCS, which is multiple chemical sensitivities.
Yeah, so someone has said, are they the same illness? So I'm assuming they
can be related. Yeah. Someone with MCAS may trigger multiple chemical sensitivity, but they're different.
Yeah.
And treating mast cell activation requires using a variety of materials, some of which could be natural supplements, some of which could be pharmaceutical agents. Again, patients vary as to which ones they respond to, but it requires a fairly comprehensive taking materials to quiet that down.
Okay, and someone has asked here, which I'm interested in as well. What would you say are the most important tools for healing or dealing with? Well, not to say healing chronic pain. We've had people on here talking around like John Sarno's work. I don't know if you do much with that, but like what are your thoughts on chronic pain?
Okay, another 2-hour lecture. Sorry. You may not know, but I was a pain specialist for 35 years. So it's something I know a little bit about.
Okay.
Once again, you have to understand what's causing the pain. We're going to come right back to what I call essential, and that's diagnosis, which is why do you have pain? And you could have pain because of structural issues. You could have pain because you have structural issues combined with inflammation caused by mold, caused by Lyme, caused by all of the other things we're talking about right now. So again, you have to, for each person separately, understand, okay, where exactly in your body is the pain? If it's localized, if your pain is in your left hip and in your neck, then we're going to think more structural. If it's total body pain, if it's pain in most of your muscles and most of your joints, it may be primarily inflammation. And let's go find the source of inflammation. What's making your body inflamed? Could be food allergy, could be, again, an infection or a toxin, and you got to search for the cause. There's a pain specialist named David Hanscom who has put together a program called DOC, which means do your own care. And he evolved his treatment of pain to include limbic and vagal issues combined with visualization specific for pain. And so David has put that together fairly nicely. But again, it's too big a question about having pain. I mean, I'll put it this way. Most of my patients who have mold toxicity or Lyme disease have pain. And the majority of that pain gets better when they get the inflammation out. When we cure the Lyme and cure the mold toxicity, they have no more pain. For some people, it's still structural. They had a fall or an injury, and there's some residual areas of the body. And for that, some osteopathic manipulation can be fabulous. And again, frequency-specific microcurrent is a great tool for treating chronic pain. But again, this is a long, big subject.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, thank you for giving it a go. I know it's that was quite like a wide ranging subject. It's quite a specific subject here, and I haven't heard of this before, but someone's asked about it. I'd like to hear some comments on dealing with Citrinin toxicity in particular. It's not commonly talked about. Is that something you've got any knowledge on?
Yeah, well, citrinin is just one of the toxins that mold makes. It's a mold toxin. It's made by several mold species, including Aspergillus and Penicillium, amongst others. And you'll see it on the Great Plains urine mycotoxin test. It's not measured by real time. It's measured by Great Plains, and you'll see that. It's merely another toxin that we look at. By itself, all it means is you have mold toxicity, and you've got to take the binders that are specific for those toxins, which in this case would be things like charcoal, clay, chlorella. Again, usually citrinin isn't a standalone on a Great Plains mycotoxin test. There's almost always ochratoxin in there and some other toxins as well. So you want to use the binders that are specific for those, and eventually you're going to pull the citrinin out fairly easily. It's not the most toxic of the materials and tends to go away faster than some of the other major named mold toxins.
So practitioner I previously worked with would, talk a lot about bentonite clay, and then the more oh my God, I can't remember it now. The more like actual like over the counter medicine for binder. What is the main binder that people use?
Well, there's no main binder. Because you have to use the binders that are specific for the toxins that show up on your urine test.
Yeah.
So for example, ochratoxin might be the most common that people have. And the best binders for those are the medications, Welchol or cholestyramine.
That's the one. Yeah.
And charcoal works weakly on that. If you had aflatoxin or trichothecene, then charcoal, bentonite clay, and chlorella are the best binders. If you had zearalenone or gliotoxin, then bentonite clay and Saccharomyces boulardii would be the best binders. So I want to specify that if you're going to do it, you should do it right, meaning use the binders that are specific for what you've got in your body. To just generically say, I have mold toxicity, I'll take a binder, you're not doing yourself a service, because a binder is almost never going to be adequate to pull toxins out of your body.
Have you had much experience? Because I was working with those, and then I started working with a practitioner who's quite heavily into CellCore and biotoxin binders, things like that. What are your view on them?
Yeah, CellCore is primarily humic and fulvic acid, and from my perspective, they're fairly weak. They don't work as well as the other ones I named. Right. I teach hundreds of physicians, and I pool their information. And so I would say that 2/3 of the physicians I work with don't find CellCore very helpful, and about 1/3 like it, but it's nowhere near as good as the others. So to get fixated on one product, and you're not doing yourself a favor, because you've read my book. In in Toxic, I lay out all of the mycotoxins that you can measure, and I have a table in which we show which binders work for which toxins. And you have to be comprehensive about it. You can't say, oh, I'm just going to use that, like CellCore. I can promise you, it's not going to get all the toxins out of your body.
Yeah. Okay.
So again, some practitioners get fixated on one product, and that's never going to serve you.
Okay.
Sorry.
No,
Sorry.
no, that's good to know. I think this is a good question.
It is good to know. You may need to know that.
Yeah. No, definitely. And I think no, it's good to. I think also maybe some practitioners have certain relationships with certain providers and stuff, and that that maybe gets mixed into it.
There is. Some of my colleagues have relationships with some of the supplement companies, and they tend to push things. One of the things that I've always refused to do would be to associate it with any lab or any company that made anything. So that since I lecture to so many physicians, I want them to know that I have no financial vested interest in anything.
Yeah.
That if I say something works, that's because I've observed it in 3,000 or 4,000 people that I've helped get completely well. I mean, it's just my experience. That's what I've got going for me.
So I've got a good question here. So are there good provider resources available? So like practitioners who maybe aren't as knowledgeable in the areas that you are, but they want to be. So this person's practitioner is very willing to learn, but feels kind of out of her depth. Where would you point them towards to kind of start maybe schooling themselves up a little bit more, or is there certain courses or anything they could take?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, they should read my books. Second, I am doing with Jill Christa, who's a naturopathic physician who also does what I do. Jill and I are very good friends. And Jill and I do what we call a mentorship program for physicians, in which every 2 months we meet virtually, like we're doing right now, and we go over cases brought to us by the membership. We have maybe up to 150 physicians doing that right now. If someone wants to do that, they can contact me through my website, which is simply neilnathanmd.com, or they can go directly to askdrnathan@gmail.com. And if they want to be involved, we're happy to have that. This next Saturday, Jill and I are putting on a whole day presentation on various topics. And we're working with Lynn Patrick, who's an expert on environmental toxicity. And so it's every 6 months to a year, we do a whole day seminar. All of these are taped. Videotaped, so if someone wants to get involved, we are happy to send them our educational materials. They can study them so they can kind of jump in at a somewhat higher level. So I welcome any physician who wants to become part of that. Jill and I want to teach as many people as we can how to do this.
Awesome. And yeah, Jill's actually been on the show before a while ago. So she was amazing. So that's great that you guys are combining. Okay, cool. And so another question, we kind of touched upon it earlier, but so someone has said, is CFS ME caused by toxins and bacterial infections, i.e. Lyme or Riketssia?
Riketssia.
Yeah.
Riketssia.
Wow, I pronounced that correctly. Or can you have both as separated diseases? Does that make sense?
Yeah, you can have both.
Okay.
So I actually got started with chronic fatigue, ME, and fibromyalgia back in the 80s, when we didn't really understand what we were looking at. It was a new phenomena, didn't make any sense. And over the next 25 years more, we've learned a great deal about those things. In the beginning, what we realized was that a lot of people who had CFS, ME, again, had these deficiencies in magnesium or thyroid, adrenal, sex hormone issues, intestinal dysbiosis, food allergy. And so if we could find those, we could help the majority of people. As my opinion, as the world got more toxic, we began to see more and more of our patients turned out to have Lyme disease or co-infections of Lyme disease, which include rickettsial infections and mold toxicity. For example, 2013, one of my colleagues, Joe Brewer, wrote a paper in which he took 112 patients who had chronic fatigue and checked them for mold toxicity, just on a urine test. And it turned out that 92% of people who were diagnosed with that had mold toxicity, and the vast majority got well when he treated mold. So for someone who has chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia or ME, you need, one more time, look for cause. That calling something CFS or ME is a description. It's not a diagnosis. It doesn't tell you what's causing it. It'll give you an idea of what symptoms you would have, but you've got to start digging into it and finding the cause. When you find the cause and treat it, the vast majority will get well. So for your listeners, my take-home message is everything I'm talking about is treatable. So that I'm always wanting to give a message of hope, meaning illnesses that other physicians do not understand. That's a travesty. Hopefully someday they will all understand it in this way, but there are enough physicians who begin to understand it, that if you have these illnesses, they're treatable, but you need to figure out cause.
Perfect. And a question around mold. Because mold is everywhere, and I think that's probably why it like starts to freak people out, me included, when I first found out about it. And particularly having grown up in a place that is, in the UK, it's wet and miserable, so there's a lot of mold. Because it feels like it's almost impossible to avoid mold, is there a certain level of mold that is acceptable to live in and still get better, or is it really dependent on the severity of the person that they're dealing with?
It does depend on the severity.
Right.
When someone is actively in the throes of having mold toxicity, they can't have it in their environment. They cannot get well if there is mold in their environment. Now, rarely does that go to the extreme that you have read about and alluded to, where you have to go live in the desert and throw away everything you've ever owned. That is rare. I know that there are people who believe that that is the answer for everybody. For very few people who are super sensitive, that is an answer. But for the majority of people with mold toxicity, they just have to get into a much cleaner environment.
Okay.
Yes, mold is all over the place, but you can create a safe living place where mold is not. If you're aware of it, it can be remediated, or you can move into a newly built environment. So for example, in the UK, and I've got a lot of patients from the UK, it is a very damp environment and very old buildings. That's a very bad recipe for, it's a good recipe if you want to get exposed to mold, but not so much. But all of my patients have found cleaner environments. So it may mean letting go of some old treasured possessions that can't be cleaned adequately, but it really means getting into a safe environment. Bottom line, I have to emphasize it, you cannot get well if you have mold toxicity if you're still living in a moldy environment. It doesn't have to be a perfectly free moldy environment. I'm not sure that that's possible, but it can be so much less moldy that healing is possible. Once someone heals from mold, they will be much, much less sensitive once they get re-exposed. So that's also important for people to know, that it doesn't mean you're a walking time bomb and you walk into a moldy environment, boom, you're going to get bad again. No, once the body fully heals, you will be less reactive.
Yeah, that's a really positive message. I'm glad you said that it doesn't need to be perfect, because I think that a lot of the personalities that get sick are these type of people who may be a perfectionist and they need everything to be perfect. And if you try and get everything, completely rid of mold, then
you're asking for a tough thing. Mold toxicity affects the brain in such a way that it tends to predispose to OCD behaviors, or especially if there was even a touch or a hint of it before, it gets worse. And so quite a few of my mold patients really get fixated on details. And it can be hard for them to begin to take a step back and look at it in perspective.
Can I, and this, again, so I'm dotting some selfish questions in here that's related to me. So I'm gonna ask another one now. Since I was younger, I've always had allergies. I've always had like hay fever and stuff like that. But I would just randomly, in the middle of winter, when there's no hay fever, when I was really tired and I'd had a bad night's sleep, I would get really like sneezy and really, those kind of hay fever kind of symptoms, but it wouldn't be in hay fever season. I shouldn't be getting them. And I always kind of just brushed it off. And then when I found out about mold, I realized whenever I went into my friend's basement apartment, and I was there for longer than an hour, I just could not stop sneezing, and my eyes were watering and all of that kind of stuff. And is that more of a mold? Because I've now realized it is when I'm in more moldy environments. Is that a mold allergy, or is that a mold toxicity? That's mold allergy.
No. You can have mold allergy, which is very different than mold toxicity.
Uh-huh.
So the symptoms you're talking about are allergy symptoms. You're absolutely correct.
Uh-huh.
So the thing is, you clearly have mold allergy and mold toxicity. Now, for many people, are you lucky you? The issue here is many people, if not most, who do get mold toxicity ultimately have their sinuses and gut colonized with mold.
Yeah.
And so if you're colonized, and most of my mold patients have, you literally have something in your body that you're allergic to. So you may need to have treatment for both mold allergy and toxicity, and they are different. So some people need treatment for mold allergy, and you clearly have that.
What are the treatments for mold allergy? Because that was something I looked into, and then I don't know, there doesn't seem to be much out there about mold allergy treatment.
Well, first of all, allergists do treat mold allergy. So you can literally get allergy shots, which people get regularly, like they would for hay fever, for mold. That is routinely done in conventional medicine all over the world. There are some newer, more effective treatments that are taught by the American Academy of Environmental Medicine that are called LDA or LDI. LDA stands for a low-dose antigen. LDI is low-dose immunotherapy. And there's a technique called potentiation neutralization, which are more effective than your classical allergy shots for mold, keeping in mind that if you get the mold out of your body, you're going to be much less allergic to it because your exposure is going to be markedly less.
And does that make sense to you that whenever I'm, because I can be in a place where I'm not sneezing and everything, and then I have a bad night's sleep, and I imagine it's because my immune system's weak because I've had a bad night's sleep. And does that make sense that my immune system would be weak? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It does.
Yeah. They never make them like short, easy words, do they? So what did you say is LDI, and that's potentialization? What was it?
Potentiation neutralization.
Potentiation. I'm just typing this in. Potentiation neutralization. I bet
So,
that's not in the UK. I bet that's only in the US, right?
well, LDA was derived from a treatment that was actually developed in the UK.
Oh, wow.
So it's not called that in the UK. Sorry, I don't remember the UK name for it, but it's very similar to what was developed there. So it might be available. Yeah.
Okay. Is that the kind of thing that you need to do regularly, or you can do it like in a specific?
If you're getting regular allergy shots, you have to keep getting them forever, unless you cure the mold in you, and then you can markedly reduce that, and not need it anymore. The others, LDA, LDI, and neutralization potentiation treatments, are more permanent. So they're better, but they're harder to find people doing it.
Okay. But if you travel to America, you could get someone who does it over there. Okay.
Right. You could look it up online. There are probably people doing it. I can't comment on the UK. I don't know specifically.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Apologies to everyone listening to that. It was a very selfish question, but hopefully, something that was useful to someone out there. So someone's asked, can you have a weak positive ELISA test from Lyme and still be severely affected? I think I know the answer to this, but please give your answer.
Oh, that's a very hard question, actually. A weak ELISA test to Lyme is exactly that. It may mean that you do have Lyme, but that Lyme has weakened your immune system so that your immune system can't react as strongly as it should. Or it may mean that you were exposed but don't actually have it at this particular point, or it could be a false positive. So since I have worked with Lyme for 25 years, unless I'm matching my patient's symptoms to Lyme disease specifically, that test may or may not be relevant. So if someone doesn't have what I think of as classical symptoms of Lyme disease and they have a weak positive, I'm not prone to throwing them into a Lyme treatment protocol because it's very stringent. It involves taking multiple antibiotics for long periods of time. It may affect their gut, and I do not want to do that to someone unless I'm convinced they have to. So a weak test is exactly that. It's a weak test, and it means that both the patient and their practitioner need to put it in context.
Okay, cool. Do you have any success stories of people lowering high pesticide levels in their body?
Yeah, lots. There are specific dietary things you can do, bless you, for improving detoxification. There are multiple materials that you can take to pull toxins out of your body, again, depending on the toxins. There's a fabulous treatment technique called intravenous phosphatidylcholine, which is a natural material that you can take to help with detoxification. Saunas, hot tubs, hot baths are great for detoxification. But the key is, if you know that there are chemicals in you, you've got to get them out. And yes, that can be done.
Yeah. But are there some people, are there some people who can just live with these things in their body just a lot easier than others? Just because I know people who certainly have a lot of chemicals and stuff and they're going on in their body and they seem to just get through life easily.
So the answer is absolutely yes.
Yeah.
That I would say that a lot of people have toxins in their body of all kinds and do okay until something happens to affect their immune system, a stress of some type. It could be childbirth or surgery or an IRS audit in our country, or death of a loved one or an illness of a loved one, but something reasonably profound. It could be a flu, COVID, that profoundly affects the immune system, so that a system that was coping with these toxins now can't. And now the toxins are part of the problem, and now we have more to treat.
Yeah, yeah. I always say on the podcast quite a lot that I actually feel quite lucky in a way to have had this earlier on in my life, just because I think a lot of people maybe have to deal with this far later on in their life, and maybe they're less open to stuff like, you know, brain retraining and stuff like that, and it's more difficult for them to, you know, to get better from it. And so I'm hopefully setting myself up for better health later on in life. I think that's the way I would try to look at it anyway.
That's the right way to look at it. I know we can't legislate health. It has a little bit to do with the cards you're dealt at birth, your genetics, your chemistry. But we can be proactive to minimize that. You know, for example, I've been treating heavy metal toxicity for a long time. And I don't know, one day I decided to test my wife and I for heavy metal toxicity. And lo and behold, we were both loaded with mercury. Now, we didn't have any symptoms. So we could have just said, I'll just ride this out. Maybe I'll never have to do anything about it. But we didn't. We treated it. We chelated the mercury out of our bodies. My thinking was, if I ever did get sick, this would put me even further behind the 8 ball. And I didn't want that happening. It would also predispose it to me. Why make my body work so hard with some toxins? It's kind of like saying, I know there's arsenic and strychnine in my system, but I don't want to do anything about it, even though I could.
Yeah.
Like, well, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So again, health is my world. I've been doing it my whole life. And health to me is a key value. Not everyone values health the way I do. I can say that now that I'm 75 years old, that health is precious.
Yeah.
I have way too many of my dear friends who are my age or younger who are hobbling around with joints that are arthritic and they can barely move, and they get up in the morning or have trouble breathing, or their heart's not working for them, or they can't walk very far. And I said I was blessed earlier. I am. So I can get up in the morning and I have no pain, and I can walk as far as I want at any time. I can hike, and I can be as active and productive as I can. I'm blessed, but it's not an accident. I work hard to do that, meaning I eat organic, and I live in the country, and I breathe fresh air, and I exercise regularly and have for many, many years. And I do Tai Chi on a regular basis, and I meditate. And so I work hard. I don't think of it as work. I think of it as maintenance, in the same way that you would think of your car. You wouldn't drive it without putting oil and water in it. And if you did operate that way, you would have a car that would stop on you in the middle of some trip that you were taking. So I don't think of it as work, and I don't think of it as being, you alluded to this before. The key to it is that I don't come to it with fear or paranoia that, oh my God, I've got to do all this, so Lord knows what's going to happen to me. I love my life. I try to live in joy, and I want to take care of my body. I love my body. It's done wonders for me for my whole life. Why would I not do that? So again, it's trying to approach it from the right perspective.
Yeah, definitely sounds like, I think it's interesting you said health is a value of yours, and it's I did this like value session last year actually, and health is now a value of mine, but I think it probably wouldn't have been a value of mine when I was, you know, in my 20s, not having these problems. So I wished it had been. Someone else has actually, you mentioned heavy metals And someone else has asked about that, and what's the best way to deal with that? And I'm quite interested in that, just because the practitioner I was dealing with suggested that I should do this chelation. I think it's like 2 days a week or 2 nights a week, or maybe it's just 1 night a week. You're essentially taking these DSMA tablets like every 4 hours, which for me was kind of off-putting, because I have such trouble with sleep anyway. It just felt like I was just going to be disrupting my sleep every week. Did you collate?
Why did you have to take it at night?
Well, it's every 4 hours, so you throughout the day. I don't know these particular ones. What? So this is why I wanted to ask you about it. When you were collating, like
you could see me shaking my head, like what? I've never heard of chelating like that.
Okay.
There are multiple ways of chelation. The most effective is intravenous.
Okay.
That may not be available in many places. So DMSA is one of the better chelating agents for both lead and mercury, which are 2 of the bigger heavy metal toxins. And there are others. But generally, I've had people take DMSA 2 days a week, 1 dose. You can base the dose on poundage or on patient's tolerance. My more sensitive patients, I use very low doses of DMSA, like 100 or 200 milligrams. 2 days a week, 1 dose. Morning is fine. I've never asked anyone to do it the way you're describing. I would never ask anyone to lose sleep over it. Makes no sense to me. I'm not even aware that that's a protocol that I've ever heard of. I never know where my colleagues get these programs from.
Well, I'm very glad you said that, because no, that's something the practitioner did say was that, because I was thinking of doing this intravenous chelation, and she said that doing it orally is the only way to go. I might have got this wrong, so apologies if I have, but it's the only way to get over the blood-brain, so the blood-brain barrier, and actually get toxic heavy metals out of your brain. Or does intravenous do that as well?
It does, probably better than taking it orally.
Okay.
But the oral medication, to some extent, will get the toxins out of your brain also. So
okay,
they work. Not quite as effective, but the IV is not available to everyone. There are only a handful of doctors actually doing it, but it's available to you. It's a more effective way of doing it.
Okay, good. Yeah, they've actually got it here in Bali, and it's cheaper here, so maybe I will look that up. Obviously, I'm sure there's varying degrees of.
Well, what efficacy. Are they using for it in Bali?
I don't know. It was someone I know out here who's dealing with chronic health issues recommended this clinic, but I haven't looked into it at all. Okay,
so what you want is someone who has access to, depending on which metals you're chelating. If you're chelating mercury, the most effective agent is DMPS.
Okay.
If you're chelating lead, the most effective agent is EDTA. And here in the States, most people who do chelation do a combination of DMPS and EDTA in each intravenous infusion, so that we're getting the maximum amount of metals out of your body.
Yeah.
Usually, I recommend doing it every 2 weeks. You've got to give the body time to get over it. If you are chelating with anything, on the days that you do it, you don't want to take any minerals, because you don't want the chelating agent to bind what you're putting into your body. But on the other days of the week, you want to take a basic multi-mineral product so that you're replacing the good minerals, which chelation will also pull out of your body.
Yeah. Okay.
Magnesium, manganese, zinc, iron, things like that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it's, no, thank you for answering that. It's, yeah, I mean, would you say, I know you focus a lot on mold. Is heavy metals sometimes the key problem for people? Is it quite often the key problem for people that people don't realize?
It's rarely the key problem. And
Mm.
when people do have mold toxicity, and I'm sorry that people think of me as a mold doctor, because I'm not. I'm, as you started, I deal with people with complicated medical problems.
Yeah.
And I happen to know a lot about mold, but I kind of know a lot about some other stuff too, like heavy metal toxicity, because I've been working with that for 25, 30 years. The cell danger response, which I mentioned previously, teaches us that as a result of trying to protect itself, the cell begins to sequester heavy metals and doesn't eliminate them the way they did. It doesn't view that as a primary thing it needs to be doing. So the vast majority of people who have mold toxicity or Lyme, when you measure it, will have heavy metal toxicity. Once you cure the mold and cure the Lyme, and you reboot the cell danger response so it's not happening anymore, the body will start to get rid of those heavy metals much more effectively. So it's a consequence of what's causing this in the first place. Very common. So if it's present, it helps to treat it, but it's rarely the cause or the major cause of what's making people sick. It can be, but in my world, it's more of a secondary process.
Makes sense. Okay. And someone's asked here about diet. And I assume it varies from person to person, but in terms of for optimum detox, what is better, like a low fat, high fruit versus meat, fat versus meat and fat?
It depends on what we're treating, again.
Yeah. Okay.
And it depends on that person's chemistry. Everybody needs a different diet. If we're treating Lyme or mold, you want a high protein, low carb diet. Many of my patients do paleo or keto. That's quite effective. If we're dealing with someone with autoimmune issues or inflammatory issues, the autoimmune paleo diet is particularly effective, with less fruit than that diet usually allows if we're dealing with mold or Lyme. So that's a crude overview.
Have you ever had any success with people doing the carnivore diet?
You know, I've just learned about it. I've just finished reading Dr.
Sean Baker?
Paul Saladino's book. And I'm fascinated by it. Again, I think that there are some people who would respond well to it. It's a fairly strict diet. In my experience, people don't do well with very strict diets. However, it has a lot in common with the autoimmune paleo diet. And I suspect that if someone could do it, it would have a very strong anti-inflammatory effect. But again, I just finished reading that book last week. So I've just learned about it, and I'm just literally studying it. I just bought the cookbook yesterday and made up one of the recipes today from it. So it's a fascinating description and completely contradicts a whole lot of other people. So I like things that promote discussion, because the truth will vary from one person to another.
Yeah.
I certainly have no problem with someone exploring it. I think it's fairly scientifically founded.
Yeah.
But I haven't used it on patients yet, so I can't speak about it as intelligently as I would like.
So someone's asked here, how can neck misalignments affect the nervous system and healing from chronic illness? And I find that interesting. I have very bad neck and have done since I've been dealing with all of this. So yeah, what's your view on that?
Well, I think that structural issues are profoundly affected by inflammation. So if you have mold or Lyme or these things that cause inflammation, the inflammation will go to the weakest area of the body. And if you have a neck misalignment, it's going to lock in there. So there's a very definite role for manipulation as a treatment. And whether it's chiropractic or osteopathic, my own training is in both. One of my first partners was a chiropractor who taught me to do that type of work. And I have 40 years of experience working with osteopaths, learning how to do that kind of work. Big fan.
Okay, cool. And so actually someone here has asked what osteopathic techniques help to reset the nervous system's healing. Maybe rather than, are there particular books or anything someone could read on that subject?
Not asking the right question.
Okay.
Well, there are different schools of osteopathic training, and so it depends. The type of osteopathic work that is very gentle, that I think is the most profound, is called biodynamic osteopathy. If you go to that website, there will be people listed there who do that. Cranial osteopathy is a very profound way of healing. Although cranial is in the name, the whole body is treated with it. It's not just based around the head. And there's a website that you can go to called the Cranial Academy, which is a branch of the osteopathic community that specializes in that. So those are places you could go to start to find a practitioner who would be skilled. Not all osteopaths do manipulation. Some of them have a more medical practice than actually doing any manipulation. It's about finding people who fit for you, who when they work on your tissues, do so respectfully, and you feel better after treatment.
Perfect. Just a couple more questions now. So someone's asked best way to get rid of marcons in the nose.
Does it matter? Okay, so I know that Dr. Shoemaker thinks that marcons is very important and is a critical component to treatment. I worked with him for many years, and I did not find that marcon treatment added much of anything to mold treatment. So I don't think that marcons matter. I don't think you need to measure it. I don't measure it anymore. I don't think it plays a role in treatment. It's a part of treatment that he thinks is important. Most people who work in the mold field have come to agree with me, but not everybody.
Okay, good. And someone's asked, what are the natural antifungals that people can take to help them rid themselves of mold colonization and or to ward off mold?
Okay. Read Jill Krista's book, Break the Mold. That's book is devoted to it and excellent.
Okay, awesome. And are there any ways, I know this is an interesting question, are there any ways to check for Lyme without being able to actually afford a test of which they aren't always accurate, i.e. going off symptoms and provoking CIP as a response?
You can do that. It really helps if you can get a test to confirm it, and you are correct. The testing is not what it needs to be in terms of accuracy. Yes. So if you provoke by taking antibiotics to see if you get a herx, you don't know if it was Lyme that you're provoking, or chlamydia pneumonia, or mycoplasma pneumonia, or other infectious agents. All you know is you're reacting to an antibiotic and it doesn't pinpoint what you've got. There are tinctures that you can take from Byron White or Beyond Balance that are specific for both mold and for the co-infections. You can do what's called a challenge test, where you can take those tinctures. If you get a herx when you take it, it's a crude piece of evidence that you may have it. But if we're going to talk about treating Lyme, it's a very long, complicated, expensive treatment. You should spring for the test.
Okay, cool. I think that's the sensible thing. Final question, and probably something that a lot of people have thought: why is it so damned hard to get people to recognize mold and Lyme as actual diseases and cause of extensive list of health problems. It's so frustrating to live with chronic health issues that are largely invisible to others and regarded as fake.
New medications, new technology in medicine is embraced quickly because there's a huge economic force driving it. New ideas have never taken in any branch of science, including medicine. The history of science is that any new idea takes a minimum of 20 years to enter the medical profession, and sometimes longer. So strangely, and I don't understand it myself, many physicians have the attitude, and I find this bizarre, which is, if it wasn't taught to me in medical school, it must not be worth knowing. So that sort of begs the question of, you mean we learn nothing after you left medical school? I was taught in medical school, and so was everyone else who ever went to medical school, that everything we're teaching you now, in 20 years, 50% will be wrong and 50% will be right. Unfortunately, we don't know which 50% is which, so you're going to have to learn it all right now. Now, some of my colleagues who went to medical school with me took that as, okay, I'll learn all this and I hope I don't have to hurt my head by learning anything more when I get back into practice. Unfortunately, that is the usual, so that most physicians do not embrace new information and only reluctantly come to it after it has been thoroughly ingrained into our consciousness by the weight of evidence that accumulates over time. So Lyme disease is a relatively new concept. We've only been at it 20, 25 years, just beginning to enter consciousness. The CDC in the United States admitted that there are 400,000 new cases of Lyme disease every year. It's an epidemic much greater than AIDS ever was. Despite that admission, there are many people who practice who don't believe that Lyme exists where they live, which is crazy because Lyme exists in every continent, in every state known. Mold is a little bit behind. It's about 10, 15 years behind in consciousness. And although it's phenomenally frustrating for me and my patients, I'm personally, by writing books and lecturing and teaching, doing everything I can to raise consciousness so people understand it. But I fully understand why patients are so frustrated. And I think it's a travesty that there are literally millions of people out there with mold toxicity that are not getting diagnosed because their doctors have never heard of it. So I understand the frustration. I live with it, but it's the history of medicine that it just evolves pathetically slowly.
Yeah, I always think, like, in 50 years, or I don't know, however many times, people will look back on this and they just won't believe how, people will have been treated. And that's not, when I say people have been treated, there's so many doctors out there with really good intentions. I tried to speak to my family doctor about mold toxicity, and he wanted to understand about it, but he was just like, I've never heard of what you're talking about. It doesn't make sense to me. And he was like, send me the stuff over. And this is someone my mum and dad trust their whole lives with, and he just doesn't have a clue.
Right.
But he wants
that the phenomena is called cognitive dissonance. And it's basically human beings will not embrace a new concept if it doesn't fit into their worldview.
Yeah.
That's a part of us. There are some of us, maybe me, who are much more open to new information. I've always thought my role in medicine was to help people that other people didn't know how to help.
Yeah.
So I kept looking for what I think of as pieces of the puzzle. My constant refrain in working with patients was, okay, we got you a little bit better. What am I missing? What don't I know that I need to know to help you?
Yeah.
So I'm wired differently than many.
Yeah.
And that's not their fault. That's just how I'm wired. I want to know more. And one of the phrases that I often use is, I actually know how little I know, and I'm terrified by how little my colleagues know. So that's perspective. What can I tell you?
No, I think I've taken it more than you. This has been the longest episode we've done, and it's been amazing. I feel like we could go on for hours and hours. I just apologies for taking up so much of your time, but it's been so. First of all, just thank you for everything you're doing and the fact that you are so open-minded. You're fighting the fight for many of us, kind of, all over the world, kind of wondering, what to do in the next step. So it's so important. There's people like you, but there's people being trained by people like you. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing your answers and sparing the time, but for everything you're doing.
Thank you for having me. My only hope is that some of my information will be helpful to your listeners and that will help them on their healing journey. If so, the time is well spent.